Hello everyone, this is Elena Perez, and this is my CLDE history research project on the Americanization policies in the 1900s and today for Mexican Americans. First of all, Mexican Americans are people who are born in Mexico or born in the United States, and they have identified as citizens of both countries. Whether this means they have legal papers saying that they have dual citizenship or if they just identify that way personally, either way, someone who has Mexican heritage and American experience. My family is Mexican American. We came over from Monterrey in 1915, and my family traveled as migrant workers with the sugar beet crop. And then in Detroit, when Henry Ford opened up his company, he needed cheap labor, so they shipped migrant workers from around the country to fill that role, and that's how my family ended up in Michigan. So this topic is something that is very close to my heart. Mexican American immigration. As you can see, over the years, immigration has gotten more and more frequent from our neighbors to the south. After World War II, there were fewer immigrants than before because there were legal restrictions that had begun. But then you can actually notice between 2010 and 2017 here, there was a kind of a slight dip. You'd expect it to just keep growing and growing and growing, but around 2017, we actually had 500 million fewer Mexican immigrants coming into the country. This could be attributed to a couple of reasons. One could be our leadership saying things like this. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Another one, but you have people coming in, and I'm not saying just Mexicans, I'm talking about people that are from all over, are killers and rapists, and they're coming into this country. So, if we were to look at this graph again, perhaps we can have a better understanding of why those numbers are dwindling due to the anti-immigrant feelings and perceptions that have been fed to the American people in the last decade or so. Nativism and Americanization. A lot of people who are in favor of English-only movements, which definitely affects our Mexican Americans in their education, are very misinformed about what this actually means. If you are actually a nativist, meaning someone who promotes the native and indigenous groups and languages of your country, then they would all be American Indians. Most of the people who are pretending to be nativists are people who are immigrants themselves to the North America area. Americanization is this kind of concept, and it relates back to our old favorite metaphor of the United States being a melting pot where all different cultures come in and they assimilate or they get Americanized, and we have one national identity that comes out. Many scholars and many people have found that this analogy is more problematic than they thought. For example, America is prized or is promoted as a country that has freedom for all religions, languages, races, and cultures. However, the push for Americanization that began around in the 1920s and really has grown stronger and stronger and stronger as the years have gone on, is really about stripping away what makes people different and turning them all into the same product or the same usable person. Assimilation and Americanization could be synonyms for each other, because assimilation means that everyone adopts the dominant culture in whatever country that they are moving into. But I think that our perspective is moving away from assimilation and Americanization into a more multicultural perspective where all cultures can coexist, and it's seen as a positive trait and a strength for our country. But we're moving there, but let's take a look at what's happened in the past. So the first major case we can look at is the Brown v. Board of Education case, the Supreme Court case in 1954. I'm going to play this video that will give you some background information, and then I'll explain why this case is significant to the Americanization policies on Mexican American students.
Racial tension related to segregation has fueled some of the most important court cases in American history. Maybe the most important case which dealt with segregation in the United States was the 1954 case of Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. To understand this landmark case, it's important to appreciate some context. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment reads, "No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." However, the Supreme Court denied equal justice in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, as the court used the idea of separate but equal to give official government approval to segregation in America. Almost 50 years later, Thurgood Marshall, a lawyer for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, led the charge in arguing that the segregation of schools violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Several similar segregation questions from different parts of the country were combined into one case, and the case of Linda Brown, a third-grade African-American student from Topeka, Kansas, led the list. Just like many of the other cases that were combined into hers, Linda was denied acceptance into white schools close to her home and was forced to attend a school miles away. While separate was considered equal at the time, Thurgood Marshall argued for the African-American families that white school facilities were often of much higher quality than the separate schools for blacks. Interestingly, in Topeka, there was really no difference in the quality of the two sets of schools. The school for blacks was equally well equipped and had excellent teachers. This focuses attention on the more important question: can schools really be equal if students are segregated merely on the basis of skin color? The Supreme Court heard arguments in the case in 1953, but the justices were deeply divided. They decided to put the case on hold to allow for new briefs and arguments. While the case was on hold, Chief Justice Fred Vinson died and was replaced by California Governor Earl Warren, who believed segregation was unconstitutional. Warren, understanding that many in the South would resist the decision, believed a unanimous decision was important to give the court's ruling legitimacy. When the case resumed in 1954, the court was still divided. Most justices believed that segregation was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equality Clause, but some believed it was a federalism issue and decisions about how to end segregation should be left to the states. The question remained: can schools really be equal if students are segregated merely based on the color of their skin? Chief Justice Warren wrote and rewrote the court's decision until he had finally achieved a unanimous opinion. Leaving the question of the equality of the schools aside, Warren wrote, "We must look instead to the effect of segregation itself on public education." So, rather than focusing on whether there was equal opportunity to attend school, they looked at the ill effects of segregation on society. The court based this decision partly on controversial doll experiments used to make the argument that separating students solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority. In a unanimous decision, the court ruled that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, the plaintiffs were deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Although some Southerners engaged in a massive resistance campaign in which they refused to follow the decision, many Southern communities gradually desegregated their schools in the coming years. The decision in Brown v. the Board of Education helped to chip away at racist social structure by outlawing segregation in schools. It helped to stimulate the Civil Rights Movement, culminating a decade later in the Civil Rights Act, which banned segregation in all public facilities, and the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed racially discriminatory voting restrictions. For more information on this and many other important court cases throughout history, be sure to check out the other.
Okay, so just to review, the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 declared separate educational facilities inherently unequal. This began the era of integration in schools. And the reason this case is important in our study of Mexican Americans and Americanization is because this case played a major role in making equal educational opportunity a central focus of educational policy. So just by the same principle that you can't segregate students based on their race, this basic principle was used to help build the Bilingual Education Act and further cases that were brought to the Supreme Court and other state courts, saying that you can't segregate students based on their linguistic ability. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was a major effort by the Johnson administration to address the effects of poverty on educational and economic achievement. This act started programs like Head Start preschools and Title I support for at-risk students. This was another important case for us when it comes to Mexican Americans and Americanization. Looking back, even though it didn't really directly tie to the Mexican Americans at the time, it was another case in our country's history that helped build us towards providing equal educational opportunities for all students, no matter what. The Bilingual Education Act of 1968 was the first comprehensive federal intervention in the schooling of language minority students. The Bilingual Education Act was introduced by Senator Ralph Yarborough of Texas. He noticed that in his home state of Texas that his Spanish-speaking students were on average 4 years of schooling behind their white peers. And this brought him to look at the lack of resources and trained personnel and the absence of special programs in our schools at the time. This was the very first big push for bilingualism in our schools and for equal opportunities for bilingual students. Yarborough says about the Bilingual Education Act, "The problem is that many of our school-aged children come from homes where the mother tongue is not English. As a result, these children enter school not speaking English and not being able to understand the instructions that is all conducted in English. There is an urgent need for this legislation to provide equal educational opportunity for those children who do not come to school with English-speaking ability." So you can see that maybe while his intentions were good, he was really pushing more towards an Americanization type policy where students were expected to assimilate to English and not really use any of their native language or literacy skills in order to help them achieve proficiency in school. The Bilingual Education Act was not a mandate for bilingual education. Since education is the responsibility of the states, the federal government can only create incentives, financial incentives, through grant programs. So if states or districts want this money, they have to meet the federal requirements. And under the Act, the districts have to implement bilingual education programs for specified target groups in order to receive federal funding. This is like an incentive for districts to consider bilingual instruction options. But there are some issues that go along with this as well. The Bilingual Education Act has been revised and edited many times over the years coming up to today. And we can see most of the flaws are that this is more of a transitional language program where the goal is to transition them from their native language to English and only use English in their schooling purposes. Nowadays, we know that bilingual education is different from what the perception of it used to be, where kids were pulled out and they had special classes and they were still given direct instruction in English in all of their other classes and expected to show proficiency on the same exams as their native speaking peers. This is an issue for Mexican Americans specifically because Spanish and other languages of people of color were not seen as academically worthy. We know that the history of bilingualism in this country starts with actually like 600,000 children being educated in German and English at the same time at the start of our public education. So what is the difference between teaching kids in German and helping them preserve their German culture and language than helping Mexican American students preserve Spanish language and their Mexican culture. I will get more to this later, but really it's interesting because it's not really that people are rejecting the idea of bilingualism since it's such a big part of our history. It's really that they're rejecting the speakers. Another key case in bilingual education in the country was Lau versus Nichols, which happened in 1974. Lau versus Nichols was a Supreme Court case that resulted in probably one of the most important court decisions for language minority students in education. What happened was the case was brought forward by Chinese American families in the San Francisco School District, who basically claimed that their students were just being put in their mainstream classes, not giving any sort of ESL or bilingual education opportunities, and then expected to just sink or swim. The school district argued that it had done nothing wrong and the Chinese American students received equal treatment to that of their other students. Justice William Douglas, in writing the court's opinion, strongly disagreed, arguing, under these state-imposed standards, there is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. For students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. We know that those who do not understand English are certain to find their classroom experiences wholly incomprehensible and in no way meaningful. This is an important case because it kind of brings together the common sense factor for bilingual education, which is if you put a student who doesn't understand English in an American school where the dominant language of instruction is English, he or she is already 5 million steps behind their English-speaking peers, simply because they won't be able to understand the basic expectations of their school, their classroom, and their classes because they don't understand the dominant language that instruction is being delivered in. This is an important case for Mexican American students over the history is because it was one of the first cases of an ethnic group of people of color who actually were fought for and their culture was seen as a strength and their language was seen as a strength rather than a hindrance. A lot of people still today think that having students speak Spanish in schools, whether they're Mexican American or not, can actually hinder their understanding of the content. But starting with Lau versus Nichols, we learned that these ethnic languages actually help students be more successful than they would if they had just tried to rely on English only. Another important case is the United States versus Texas in 1971 and then again in 1981. This affected all Texas schools, and this was directly affecting Mexican American students as Texas is right on the border of Mexico. The court had ordered the school district to create a plan and implement language programs that would help Mexican American students learn English and adjust to American culture and also help Anglo students learn English. Jose Cardenas, this man pictured here, had the theory of incompatibilities, which basically sought to prove that the failure of these Mexican American students to achieve proficiency in English was not because of their inherent failure as students or as people. It was because of the inadequacies of the structures of the programs that were in place at the time. This is another significant case for our Mexican American students because it helped take the focus off of the students and back onto the policies and the schools in which they were trying to learn. Nowadays, we have instructional strategies like these ones listed here that are given to teachers to help them teach students who are English learners or any other students. All of these instructional strategies are just good for all students. But back then, especially around the time of this case, teachers didn't really try to modify their instructional style or their content in order to help English learners. And that's basically the main problem that Jose Cardenas was pointing out, was that the problems were with the structures and with our teachers and our schools and not because of the students. Then we get to more modern educational policy like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. No Child Left Behind was written into law by President George W. Bush in 2002. As this comic shows, it was a huge push for our country for standardized testing, and state funding and school funding was attached to the testing results. A lot of teachers and students felt like this was just a lot of hoops for them to jump through, but no one really more so than language learners, because language learners were expected to achieve extremely high levels of proficiency that were basically impossible for them to achieve, considering the fact that they were also learning the language of the test at the same time. Race to the Top is an extremely similar measure to No Child Left Behind. It's a competitive grants program signed by Arne Duncan under President Barack Obama in 2009. Competitive grants program that gave different schools opportunities to get federal funding based on their testing data. Again, this is also problematic for our English language learners because of the unrealistic expectations for proficiency. Every year, our school typically underperforms on our state and national testing, and one of our biggest target groups for low scoring students is our English language learners. And even without the English language learner tag on our school system, male Hispanic students have historically been one of the lowest target groups for scoring on these standardized assessments. So Mexican American students have another hoop to jump through nowadays, even with all the history of bilingual education that people have been fighting for. Today, I think things are a little more positive. Multiculturalism and multilingualism is a bit more accepted and encouraged. Mexican American people are more seeing their identity and finding it in and out of American culture, and where they can fit in, where they can add to our culture, where they can strengthen our country. Unfortunately, there is still this big push for the English-only movement. A lot of misinformed people still want English to be our only language and get upset when they hear even just people talking to each other in other languages. So we still have a little bit of work to do. This year I went to a 2018 WIDA conference actually last week, and I just wanted to share some of my notes from the conference. I saw Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings speak, and she talked about the history of bilingual education, and here's some other details that I didn't quite get into in my presentation. But one of the main takeaways from her speech was that the issue is not bilingualism, because we have such a long history of that in this country. It's a rejection of the speakers themselves. So we can circle back to Brown versus Board of Education, and segregation is still alive and well, and these racist and prejudiced views of other languages and cultures still exist in our country. I think that a lot of teachers and people involved in educational policy today are now starting to see the error of their ways and starting to see multiculturalism and multilingualism as a strength. And I'd like to leave you with just this video that explains the benefits of bilingualism as just a way to ground why we need to support our bilingual students and our students who have multi-cultures or many cultures, for example, like our Mexican American students.
Hablas español? Parlez-vous français? 你会说中文吗? If you answered sí, oui, or 会, and you're watching this in English, chances are you belong to the world's bilingual and multilingual majority. And besides having an easier time traveling or watching movies without subtitles, knowing 2 or more languages means that your brain may actually look and work differently than those of your monolingual friends. So, what does it really mean to know a language? Language ability is typically measured in two active parts, speaking and writing, and two passive parts, listening and reading. While a balanced bilingual has near equal abilities across the board in two languages, most bilinguals around the world know and use their languages in varying proportions. And depending on their situation and how they acquired each language, they can be classified into three general types. For example, let's take Gabriella, whose family immigrates to the U.S. from Peru when she's 2 years old. As a compound bilingual, Gabriella develops two linguistic codes simultaneously, with a single set of concepts, learning both English and Spanish as she begins to process the world around her. Her teenage brother, on the other hand, might be a coordinate bilingual, working with two sets of concepts, learning English in school while continuing to speak Spanish at home and with friends. Finally, Gabriella's parents are likely to be subordinate bilinguals, who learn a secondary language by filtering it through their primary language. Because all types of bilingual people can become fully proficient in a language, regardless of accent or pronunciation, the difference may not be apparent to a casual observer. But recent advances in brain imaging technology have given neurolinguists a glimpse into how specific aspects of language learning affect the bilingual brain. It's well known that the brain's left hemisphere is more dominant in analytical and logical processes, while the right hemisphere is more active in emotional and social ones. Though this is a matter of degree, not an absolute split. The fact that language involves both types of functions, while lateralization develops gradually with age, has led to the critical period hypothesis. According to this theory, children learn languages more easily because the plasticity of their developing brains lets them use both hemispheres in language acquisition, while in most adults, language is lateralized to one hemisphere, usually the left. If this is true, learning a language in childhood may give you a more holistic grasp of its social and emotional contexts. Conversely, recent research showed that people who learn a second language in adulthood exhibit less emotional bias and a more rational approach when confronting problems in the second language than in their native one. But regardless of when you acquire additional languages, being multilingual gives your brain some remarkable advantages. Some of these are even visible, such as higher density of the gray matter that contains most of your brain's neurons and synapses, and more activity in certain regions when engaging a second language. The heightened workout a bilingual brain receives throughout its life can also help delay the onset of diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia by as much as 5 years. The idea of major cognitive benefits to bilingualism may seem intuitive now, but it would have surprised earlier experts. Before the 1960s, bilingualism was considered a handicap that slowed a child's development by forcing them to spend too much energy distinguishing between languages, a view based largely on flawed studies. And while a more recent study did show that reaction times and errors increased for some bilingual students in cross-language tests, it also showed that the effort and attention needed to switch between languages triggered more activity in, and potentially strengthened, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that plays a large role in executive function, problem solving, switching between tasks, and focusing while filtering out irrelevant information. So, while bilingualism may not necessarily make you smarter, it does make your brain more healthy, complex, and actively engaged. And even if you didn't have the good fortune of learning a second language as a child, it's never too late to do yourself a favor and make the linguistic leap from hello to hola, bonjour, or ni haos. Because when it comes to our brains, a little exercise can go a long way.
Okay, so I think that we can end on a hopeful note, knowing that this is the trend that most teachers are following, and this is the direction that our policies are going in. Thank you very much.